Imagine walking through a forest on a quiet afternoon. Sunlight filters through the leaves above you, birds call in the distance, and beneath your feet lies what appears to be nothing more than dirt and tangled roots. To most of us, plants are the backdrop of life. Silent, passive, unaware. They grow where they are planted, reaching for sunlight without thought or intention. At least, that's what we've always believed. But what if that picture is completely wrong? What if the grass beneath your shoes is making choices? What if the flowers in a garden can distinguish friend from stranger? What if, hidden beneath the soil, plants are capable of recognizing their own family? It sounds like the beginning of a science fiction story, the kind of claim that belongs in myths, not laboratories. After all, plants don't have brains. They don't possess eyes to see, ears to hear, or nervous systems to process information the way animals do. They don't move toward one another to embrace, nor do they call out warnings in voices we can hear. For centuries, we have defined intelligence by the characteristics we recognize in ourselves: memory, decision-making, social behavior, family bonds. These were considered uniquely human traits, or at the very least, the domain of animals. Plants were different. Plants were simple. Plants were silent. And yet, over the last few decades, a series of extraordinary discoveries has forced scientists to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps our definition of intelligence has been too narrow. Perhaps life has developed ways of sensing, responding, and even cooperating that don't resemble human behavior at all. And perhaps the beings we've overlooked for thousands of years have been doing something remarkable right beneath our feet. Because scientists discovered that some plants can recognize their own family, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. The implications of this discovery are difficult to overstate. If plants can distinguish siblings from strangers, then they are not simply reacting blindly to their environment. They are gathering information, comparing signals, adjusting behavior based on who surrounds them. In other words, they are making decisions. The forest suddenly becomes something very different. Picture two young seedlings emerging from the soil side by side. They share the same sunlight, the same patch of earth, and the same limited supply of water. Conventional wisdom suggests they should compete aggressively. Evolution rewards survival, and survival often means taking as much as possible before someone else does. Their roots should spread rapidly, invading every available inch of soil. Their leaves should stretch upward, casting shadows over neighboring plants. Every individual for itself. And yet, that's not always what happens. In some cases, these seedlings behave with surprising restraint. Their roots grow differently, their competition soft. Instead of acting like rivals fighting for resources, they appear to cooperate. The strangest part is that this shift only occurs under specific circumstances. When they are family, at first glance, the idea seems absurd. Family implies recognition. Recognition implies awareness. Awareness suggests complexity, and complexity is the last thing most people associate with plants. But history is filled with examples of humanity underestimating the natural world. There was a time when people believed birds migrated to the moon during winter, a time when whales were considered fish, a time when the intricate communication systems of bees were dismissed as instinctive noise. Again and again, science has revealed that the boundaries separating humans from the rest of life are far less rigid than we once imagined. Perhaps plants are simply the next frontier. The truth is that our misunderstanding of plants began with an illusion. Unlike animals, their lives unfold on a timescale we rarely notice. A predator lunges, a bird takes flight, a wolf hunts. Their actions are immediate and dramatic. Plants, by contrast, move slowly, too slowly for human perception. A vine wraps itself around a support over days. Roots navigate through soil over weeks. Trees alter growth patterns over seasons. Their decisions, if they exist, happen in silence and patience. But slow does not mean simple. If you could accelerate time and watch a forest over the course of months, compressed into minutes, you would witness a world in constant motion. Branches twisting toward light, leaves opening and closing, roots exploring underground landscapes with astonishing precision, plants responding to drought, insects, changing temperatures, and chemical cues from neighboring organisms. Far from passive, they are engaged in an endless dialogue with their environment. The question scientists eventually asked was both simple and revolutionary. Could they also recognize each other? To answer that question, researchers designed experiments that challenged one of biology's oldest assumptions. They took seeds from the same parent plant and grew them together. Then they compared them to unrelated plants raised under identical conditions. Same soil, same water, same access to sunlight. The only difference was lineage. If plants lacked any form of recognition, there should be no difference at all. A sibling should be treated exactly the same as a stranger. What happened next stunned researchers. Certain plants behaved differently depending on who stood beside them. When growing near unrelated individuals, they expanded their root systems aggressively, competing intensely for underground resources. But when surrounded by siblings, they often reduced that competition. Their roots spread in altered patterns. Their strategies changed. It was as though they recognized that cooperation with relatives could benefit the entire family line. For scientists accustomed to viewing plants as biological machines governed by simple reflexes, the results were deeply unsettling. Because the experiments hinted at something extraordinary, plants weren't merely surviving, they were evaluating, adjusting, choosing. And if that was true, then the world beneath our feet had been hiding a secret all along. The roots of a forest might not just be tangled by accident, they might be connected by relationships we are only beginning to understand. As researchers dug deeper into this mystery, one question overshadowed all others. How could a creature without a brain possibly know who its family is? How does a silent organism buried in darkness identify siblings it has never seen? The answer would lead scientists into one of the strangest and most fascinating investigations in modern biology, an invisible world of chemical whispers, hidden signals, and underground conversations that challenge everything we thought we knew about what it means to be alive. The answer, as it turned out, wasn't hidden in leaves reaching toward the sky. It was buried underground, in a place humans had rarely bothered to look closely enough. Beneath every forest floor exists a world almost entirely invisible to us. A dense labyrinth of roots pushes through grains of soil, weaving around stones, fungi, bacteria, insects, and countless microscopic organisms. To human eyes, it appears chaotic. But for plants, this underground environment is rich with information. Every root releases chemical compounds into the surrounding soil. Sugars, proteins, hormones, secondary metabolites, tiny molecular signatures that alter the environment around them. For decades, scientists assumed these substances were little more than byproducts of growth, waste materials leaking into the earth without purpose. But gradually, evidence began to suggest something far more extraordinary. These chemicals carried messages. Plants, it seemed, were constantly broadcasting information. The breakthrough came when researchers began repeating kin recognition experiments across different species. If the original findings had been an anomaly, they shouldn't be reproducible. Science demands skepticism. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Yet again and again, similar patterns emerged. In carefully controlled environments, plants altered their behavior depending on who surrounded them. One of the most striking examples involved a modest flowering plant called sea rocket. It wasn't an ancient redwood or an exotic rainforest species. It was an unremarkable coastal plant that most people would walk past without a second glance. But sea rocket changed everything. Researchers grew groups of seedlings under identical conditions. Some shared the same mother plant, others were unrelated strangers. The expectation was straightforward. Competition should remain constant. Resources are limited. Natural selection rewards individuals that maximize their own survival. Yet the seedlings had other ideas. When sea rocket plants grew beside strangers, their roots expanded aggressively into the soil. They behaved exactly as evolutionary theory predicted. Competitors racing to secure nutrients before someone else could claim them. But when growing beside siblings, they held back. Their root systems became less aggressive. They invested differently. Instead of escalating competition, they appeared to reduce it. The implications were astonishing. Imagine placing two children in a room filled with food. Conventional assumptions about survival suggest each child should grab as much as possible. Yet somehow, without instruction, one child recognizes the other as family and chooses restraint. That was essentially what these plants appeared to be doing. Not out of kindness. Not because they possessed human emotions, but because evolution may have discovered that helping close relatives can improve the survival of shared genes. Suddenly, the old narrative of nature as nothing more than ruthless competition began to crack. Because cooperation had entered the conversation. As more studies emerged, scientists observed similar behaviors in other species. Certain desert shrubs modified their growth around relatives. Agricultural crops adjusted root expansion, depending on genetic similarity. Some plants even appeared to allocate resources differently when surrounded by kin. The phenomenon became increasingly difficult to dismiss. And yet, one enormous question remained. How? How does a seedling no larger than a fingernail identify another seedling as its sibling? There are no photographs exchanged beneath the soil, no spoken introductions, no family reunions among the roots. Somewhere in the darkness, an invisible recognition system was operating. Researchers began investigating the possibility that plants identify one another through chemical fingerprints. Every organism possesses a unique biochemical profile shaped by its genetics. Closely related individuals often share similar molecular signatures. When roots release compounds into the surrounding soil, neighboring plants can detect those compounds through specialized receptors. In essence, they may be sampling the identities of those around them, not seeing, not hearing, but sensing. Imagine walking into a crowded room blindfolded and recognizing a family member purely through a familiar scent carried in the air. The process may not resemble human recognition, but recognition nonetheless. And it doesn't stop there. The soil itself is alive. A single teaspoon of healthy soil contains billions of microorganisms. Bacteria form partnerships with roots. Fungi stretch delicate threads through the earth, creating vast underground networks that connect multiple plants. Some scientists have compared these fungal pathways to biological highways. Others call them the wood wide web. Through these fungal relationships, nutrients can move between plants. Signals warning of drought, disease, or insect attack may spread throughout connected communities. The forest floor, once believed to be silent, increasingly resembles a complex communication network. Whether fungi directly assist in kin recognition remains an area of ongoing research, but their presence adds another layer of mystery. Because the more scientists learn about plant behavior, the harder it becomes to describe plants as isolated individuals. Perhaps they have never truly been alone. Perhaps forests function less like collections of separate trees and more like communities shaped by relationships. Still, skepticism remained. Some researchers argued that these findings were being exaggerated. Were scientists projecting human concepts onto organisms fundamentally different from ourselves? Was family recognition simply an accidental consequence of shared genetics? The debate intensified, and perhaps that debate was healthy. Science advances not through certainty, but through challenge. Every extraordinary claim must survive repeated testing, criticism, and scrutiny. Yet, despite disagreements about interpretation, the observations themselves persisted. Plants often behave differently around relatives. The evidence refused to disappear. Slowly, the conversation shifted. The question was no longer whether plants can distinguish kin under certain conditions. The question became why evolution favored such behavior in the first place. Because nature is efficient. Traits that persist across generations usually offer advantages. Competition can be beneficial, it drives adaptation, it strengthens survivors. But excessive competition among close relatives may harm the collective success of shared genes. By reducing conflict within families, plants may increase the likelihood that at least some members survive environmental hardships. It's a strategy both ruthless and elegant, not cooperation born from affection, but cooperation shaped by survival. The realization carries an unsettling implication. For centuries, humans have divided life into neat categories: thinking creatures, feeling creatures, instinct-driven creatures, passive organisms. Plants occupied the lowest rung of that hierarchy. Useful, beautiful, essential, but ultimately simple. What if simplicity was merely an illusion created by our inability to perceive another form of intelligence? Because intelligence doesn't always look like problem-solving puzzles or building cities. Sometimes, intelligence may emerge as flexibility, sensitivity, adaptation, the ability to gather information and modify behavior in response. By that definition, the roots beneath our feet begin to look very different. But perhaps the most surprising discovery was still waiting. Because family recognition isn't always peaceful. Not every plant chooses cooperation. Not every sibling relationship ends in harmony. In certain species, relatives continue to compete fiercely despite shared genetics. Some prioritize personal survival above collective success. Others shift strategies depending on environmental stress, scarcity, or opportunity. Even beneath the soil, family can be complicated. Nature, after all, isn't a fairy tale. And as scientists uncovered these darker patterns, they stumbled upon a truth that felt strangely familiar. The plant kingdom wasn't revealing a world entirely alien to our own, it was reflecting it. A world where cooperation and competition coexist, where survival sometimes requires sacrifice, and where the line between self-interest and collective good is never as simple as it seems. The deeper researchers looked into the hidden lives of plants, the more they realized they had opened a door they might never fully close. Because if roots can recognize family, what else have plants been doing all this time while humanity wasn't paying attention? For most of human history, we have looked at plants and seen stillness. A tree stood where it stood. A flower bloomed where it bloomed. A forest appeared peaceful from a distance. Yet the deeper scientists ventured into the hidden world beneath the soil, the more that illusion began to unravel. Because family recognition was never the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The moment researchers accepted that plants could distinguish relatives from strangers, an even more profound question emerged. What do they do with that information? The answer turned out to be far more complex than anyone expected. At first, the discovery seemed almost comforting. Plants appeared willing to reduce competition among siblings. Resources were shared more efficiently. Growth patterns shifted in ways that benefited related individuals. It sounded remarkably cooperative, remarkably harmonious, almost wholesome. But nature rarely operates according to human ideals. And as additional studies accumulated, scientists discovered that family recognition does not automatically lead to kindness. In some environments, sibling plants continue competing intensely despite recognizing one another. In others, cooperation only occurs when resources are abundant. When drought strikes, nutrients become scarce, or survival hangs in the balance, even close relatives may revert to aggressive competition. The pattern feels strangely familiar, because throughout the natural world, cooperation and conflict often exist side by side. A wolf may protect members of its pack while competing against neighboring packs. A colony of ants may function as a unified organism while engaging in relentless warfare against rival colonies, and plants, it seems, are no exception. Family matters, but survival matters too. The balance between those forces is never simple. In some species, researchers observed that sibling plants actually grew larger root systems when resources became limited. Rather than peacefully sharing everything, they adapted strategies designed to maximize survival under difficult conditions. The lesson was clear. Recognition does not dictate behavior, it merely provides information. And what an organism chooses to do with that information depends on circumstances. This realization transformed the scientific conversation. The real significance of kin recognition wasn't that plants behave like humans, it was that they make context-dependent adjustments. They gather information about their surroundings and modify their behavior accordingly. That may not sound extraordinary at first, until you remember that we're talking about organisms without brains, without neurons, without consciousness as we understand it. And yet they continuously assess risks, opportunities, environmental conditions, neighboring plants, microbial communities, water availability, and chemical signals. Every moment, every day, every season. For decades, people imagined plants as passive objects reacting mechanically to stimuli. The evidence now paints a very different picture, not conscious in the human sense, not intelligent in the animal sense, but undeniably responsive, undeniably dynamic, and perhaps far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. The implications extend far beyond scientific curiosity, because understanding how plants interact with relatives may help solve some of humanity's most pressing challenges. Take agriculture. Modern farming often treats crops as isolated units. Fields are designed for maximum efficiency, with little consideration for the social interactions occurring underground. But what if those interactions matter? Researchers have begun exploring whether planting genetically related crops together could reduce competition and improve resource efficiency. If certain plants naturally cooperate with relatives, farmers might one day design agricultural systems that work with evolutionary strategies rather than against them. Imagine fields where crops compete less aggressively for water, where nutrients are utilized more efficiently, where yields increase not because of additional chemicals, but because the plants themselves are behaving differently. The possibilities are enormous. And agriculture is only the beginning. Forests around the world face unprecedented pressures from climate change, drought, disease, and habitat destruction. Restoring damaged ecosystems requires more than simply planting trees. It requires rebuilding relationships. Scientists are increasingly interested in understanding how kin groups influence forest resilience. Some evidence suggests that related trees may support one another through underground networks, improving survival rates during periods of environmental stress. If those relationships prove significant, future reforestation efforts could be designed around family structures rather than random planting patterns. In other words, the future of conservation may depend on understanding social dynamics among organisms we once considered incapable of social behavior. That idea would have sounded absurd only a few decades ago. Today, it represents a growing area of research, and perhaps that is the most fascinating part of this entire story, not what we've learned. But how much remains unknown? Because every answer seems to generate even bigger questions. Can plants remember previous experiences? Can they learn? Can they communicate complex information? How extensive are the underground networks connecting forests? What role do fungi play in coordinating these relationships? And perhaps the most provocative question of all, how many forms of intelligence exist that humans simply fail to recognize? History offers a humbling lesson. Again and again, humanity has mistaken unfamiliarity for absence. We once believed animals lacked emotions, then we discovered grief in elephants, empathy in rats, playfulness in crows, problem-solving in octopuses. Each discovery forced us to redraw the boundaries of what life is capable of. Now plants are challenging those boundaries once again. Not because they think like us, but because they don't. Their solutions evolved along an entirely different path. No brains, no eyes, no voices, and yet somehow they sense, adapt, communicate, cooperate, compete, and recognize family. The more we study them, the stranger they become. Perhaps that strangeness is precisely why they matter. Because plants reveal a blind spot in human perception, we tend to value what resembles ourselves. Movement captures our attention. Faces trigger recognition. Voices demand response. Plants possess none of these qualities. So for centuries we overlooked their complexity. The forest remained silent only because we didn't know how to listen. But silence and absence are not the same thing. Beneath every step we take, roots are exploring unknown territory. Chemical messages are flowing through the soil. Relationships are forming. Decisions are being made. Life is unfolding according to rules we are only beginning to understand. And somewhere beneath a canopy of leaves, a young seedling encounters another root in the darkness. It cannot see, it cannot hear, it has no brain to process the encounter. Yet somehow, through signals hidden from human senses, it recognizes something familiar: family. A concept we once believed belonged only to creatures capable of thought. Now revealed within organisms we barely considered alive, in the same way we considered ourselves alive. That realization changes more than biology. It changes perspective. Because perhaps intelligence is not a single destination reached through one evolutionary path, perhaps it is a spectrum expressed in countless forms. Some build civilizations. Some navigate oceans. Some solve puzzles. And some quietly communicate beneath the soil, hidden from view, carrying on relationships millions of years older than humanity itself. The next time you walk through a forest, a garden, or even a patch of grass pushing through a crack in the sidewalk, consider what may be happening below. A hidden network of interactions, a world of chemical conversations, a family tree that extends not through branches alone, but through roots intertwined in darkness. For generations, humans believed plants were passive spectators in the story of life. Now we know they were participants all along. And perhaps the greatest mystery isn't that plants can recognize their own family. Perhaps the greatest mystery is how many other secrets have been quietly growing around us while we were too distracted to notice. Because the natural world has never stopped speaking, we're only beginning to understand its language.